Good afternoon and thanks for watching the Global News Relay. My name's Matilda Marozzi. Amid speculation the newspaper industry is dying, journalist and historian Rachel Buchanan decided to take a look at the life and death of newspapers in Melbourne. This work culminated in her project, the Melbourne Sirius, an obituary to over 500 failed mastheads within the city. Reporter Allison Worrall took the time to have a chat to Rachel about her work.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Melbourne Sirius and what inspired you to create that newspaper?
Yeah, so the Melbourne Sirius is basically an illustrated obituary to newspapers, and the newspapers it's talking about are just papers produced in Melbourne CBD between 1838 and now. And it was a new way for me, it was a new way of thinking about newspapers and how we might talk about them now. I was really shocked to learn that there was more than 500 failed newspapers. So I found an old card catalogue with this list of all these newspapers that would be made in Melbourne, and that's when my thinking started to change. I had imagined there were maybe 30 or 40 failed newspapers, but I was looking at newspapers in the wrong way. So the newspapers we have left, the big dailies, the News Limited one and the Fairfax one, are really freaks of nature in a way that they've survived for such a long time. Most newspapers are small, sort of family-run concerns that are serving a particular community, and I got really fascinated with them. So Melbourne Sirius is a list of the names, birth dates and death dates of these newspapers, and then it's photographs of about 170 mastheads of these dead papers.
Do you know if the sheer number, the 525 that are now defunct, is that common in Australia elsewhere, or is Melbourne a particular hotspot for newspapers?
That's a great question. Australia was a particular hotspot for newspapers in the late 19th century. People would often comment that Australia was a newspaper nation. In Victoria in 1883 there were 200 titles published every week, so that's Melbourne and country Victoria. And it was a highly literate population who were quite wealthy, had the money to buy newspapers and spend time reading them. So I think that, Australia was one of the world leading nations for reading and making newspapers. But I would say that Sydney probably has just as many failures. I don't think it's unique to Melbourne at all, yeah.
What is it that personally interests you about newspapers?
They're really, really beautiful objects, and they're really idiosyncratic objects. So I think that lots of the newspapers I was looking at were the result of people's passion. So whether that was, Michael Gudinski, the music promoter, as a young man thinking I'm going to produce a paper called The Daily Planet, and I'm going to just write about the bands that I love. And that's what he did with his mates. Or whether it was, the Welsh-speaking person who'd immigrated to Australia, wanted to read something in Welsh, which is a really quite an unusual language, and deciding I'm going to make a newspaper that's in Welsh. I think it's that passion that really captured me, and just the weirdness of them, just the weirdness of what newspapers used to be like. The fact that you'd have newspapers where there wasn't news until page 6, that there'd be obituaries on the front page, and then be women's athletics on page 3, in the 1930s, a whole half page devoted to photographs of babies and children in an ideal child competition. This is in The Age, so we're so serious now and kind of dull in a way compared to how wild people were and how wild newspapers were.
You've just mentioned some then, but what do you think was the quirkiest newspaper that you looked over in your research?
Well, there was one newspaper that was 8 pages long and 4 pages were blank. So they just, it was like they didn't have the content, or they forgot to make up a plate, I don't know. So there were some of those that there were newspapers. There was one called The Blade, and it was in the 19th century, and the first issue had a masthead with a giant sword dripping with blood off it, and the blade. And then every issue for the first 5 issues had a different masthead. So someone had drawn them and then they'd made up the plate. So I just loved that creativity.
Was there a time when the newspapers were particularly popular compared to now? As you said, we've only got, 3 dailies left in Melbourne or something like that.
Yeah, well, circulations were certainly massive in the 1950s and 1960s. So I think, 600,000 copies of The Sun used to be sold every day, and 500,000 copies of The Herald, and however many thousand copies of The Age. So massive, massive readership. And if you think Melbourne was probably a third of the size that it is now, everyone bought at least 1 newspaper a day, and probably 2. So perhaps that was the peak. But even in the 1970s and 80s, newspapers were still selling, probably more than 1 million copies a day. So Yeah, perhaps that was the peak.
Do you see newspapers in Australia as having a long future?
No, I don't. No. We're at the end of the era of mass manufacturing of newspapers now. Morry Schwartz has launched this Saturday paper, and perhaps that's an example of what's going to come. We're going to kind of go back to the future in a way where there are small newspapers produced by people who have perhaps money from some other, philanthropic newspapers that are serving a niche audience. So that newspaper is aimed at a particular demographic, and maybe we're going to see more of that. There'll continue to be newspapers for people who like watching greyhound racing, and perhaps that's going to continue for quite a while. There are still newspapers in languages other than English serving elderly Greek and Italian speaking Australians. There are newspapers for young Indian Australians. So perhaps we're going to see that will continue on, but these gigantic newspapers with huge staffs, that is really coming to an end now.
Morry Schwartz is a book publisher and property developer based in Melbourne. After almost 40 years in book publishing and launching the quarterly essay and the monthly magazine in the early 2000s, Morry decided to launch a new newspaper on March 1st. Reporter Matilda Marozzi spoke to Morry about his decision and the Australian media landscape. Morry Schwartz, thanks a lot for joining the Global News Relay.
My pleasure.
You've done something that I think has confounded a lot of people, and in earlier this year, in 2014, you've opened a newspaper in a time where our traditional newspapers have been downsizing, laying off journalists. What made you decide that now would be a good time to launch the Saturday paper?
Well, that's the very reason. I see that, I think the best time to start anything or enter any field or industry is when that industry is in crisis, when that industry is in trouble, and I see opportunity where others see trouble and difficulty. The legacy newspaper companies are obviously suffering. They're suffering because of legacy costs and legacy cultures, which are difficult to maintain now that so much of the revenue has flowed out of print and flowed out of the main players. The media companies have lost a lot of the revenue to the various portals, the real estate portals in the classifieds, the job portals, the car portals. So their prime income has disappeared. We are not, with the Saturday paper, we're not going to be dependent on that. It's designed differently. We've rebuilt the system. We've created a new model where that is not necessary.
Realistically, do you see print publications in the future leaning towards catering for niche rather than mass markets?
Yes, I think that's probably correct, but not in all cases. I think that it's still possible to create a national voice, a centralised national voice, and I think that this paper will do that. At least that's what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for a newspaper that covers Australia in its entirety.
Recently, there's been a few big-name media brands moving into Australia. They include The Guardian, which has already started up their website, the Daily Mail are talking about doing it, and BuzzFeed are talking about opening an Australian branch. Now, these have all decided just to open a digital and an online interface for users to interact with their product. Why was it important for you to do a print publication for people to access the content that you're making?
Well, two main reasons. These brands in the main that you're talking about, particularly the Mail and the Guardian, are very well known as paper products. People have known them forever. Every time you go to London or even get them here. So these have already established themselves. I think that you need to start with paper so people get a sense of what the paper is, of what this outlet looks like. That's the one reason. The other reason is I still believe that there's a lot of demand for paper. People like reading. People like reading on paper. People like the experience of being on paper, and particularly if the paper is different to what other papers have been. If the paper is of very high quality, white, the printing is of high quality, it becomes a pleasure.
I read a statistic that suggested that publishing only accounts for around 1% of your turnover, but 30% of your time. What got you into it, and what keeps you launching new publications and remaining in the print sector?
Well, I love publishing. I've been doing it for 40 years. I started book publishing 40 years ago, And I think that besides loving it, it's no longer 30%, it's probably now 50% of my time, and it's no longer 1%, but fast growing, because I've got we've got a growing media company that will make a profit. In fact, the monthly, the quarterly essay, Black Ink, as one unit already are well in profit. And the Saturday Paper, I'm very confident will be a profitable enterprise. It's a business.
For any business, you have to plan for the future. And I was wondering how you see the future of Australia media panning out. Do you think it'll look different to how it does today in, say, 10 or 15 years' time?
Oh, there's nothing surer that is going to be dramatically different. I'm no prophet, I can't tell you what's going to happen, but obviously it's going to be, the media will be much more diverse. With entry being much easier nowadays, the cost of entry, and with all these new people coming into the industry who understand the new media, we're going to have a lot of voices. But I think we'll still have some centralised voices. And I think that the major TV stations, the radio stations, the major newspapers are still going to be there, but there'll also be many other voices competing. And that's a very good thing.
Morry Schwartz, thanks for joining the Global News Relay and good luck with the new paper.
Thank you.